I was being brought to set in a wheelchair. Like, I couldn't walk that far. So I had to tell everybody because I needed help. You know, I needed someone to help me stand, and I needed someone to help. I needed someone to help me to get there.
On January 28, 2026, 4 people walked onto the stage of the Wiltern Theater in Los Angeles for the first time together since 1997. Ed O'Neill, Katie Sagal, David Faustino, and Christina Applegate, leaning on a cane, raising it above her head while the crowd chanted one word over and over, Bundy. It was billed as An Evening with the Bundys, a one-night-only benefit for Race to Erase MS, and it was the first live reunion of the core cast since their sitcom ended almost 30 years earlier. $2 from every ticket went to the charity, an organization dedicated to MS treatment and research, and by most accounts it was Christina herself who suggested tying the event to that cause rather than treating it as a straightforward nostalgia show. This is not a story about what she exposed that night, because nothing scandalous happened. What actually came out of that stage, and the years leading up to it, is something quieter and, honestly, more interesting. A nearly 4-decade relationship between a teenage actress and a co-star who became something like family to her, told mostly in her own words, across interviews, a podcast, and now a reunion event 39 years in the making. It's worth being upfront about what this script is and isn't. It isn't a tell-all. Christina Applegate has never accused Ed O'Neill of wrongdoing, never described their relationship as anything other than deeply positive, and never suggested there's a hidden scandal behind the scenes of Married, with Children. What she has done, repeatedly and on the record, is describe in detail what he meant to her, as a scene partner, as an authority figure on a chaotic set, and later as one of the steadiest relationships in her adult life. That's the story. No embellishment required. When Married, with Children premiered on Fox in April 1987, it was one of the network's first original series, airing during the same launch window that also introduced other early Fox programming as the network tried to establish an identity distinct from the Big Three. It was designed, deliberately, to be a loud rejection of the wholesome family sitcom formula that had defined network television for decades. Critics at the time were divided. Some called it crude, others recognized it as something genuinely new, but audiences noticed immediately. It became a cornerstone of Fox's early lineup and, over 11 seasons, one of the longest-running live-action sitcoms in American television history, eventually totaling 259 episodes across a decade on the air. Christina Applegate was 15 years old when she landed the role of Kelly Bundy, the not-so-bright, over-the-top daughter of shoe salesman Al Bundy. Ed O'Neill, who played Al, was in his early 40s, already an established stage and screen actor with theater training that would later shape how he worked on set. Applegate has since said she read for the role almost as a formality, because she and her mother had already watched the pilot together and loved it before she ever auditioned. Talking with O'Neill decades later on her podcast, she described her reaction to seeing him on screen for the first time. She and her mom couldn't stop laughing at a bit where his character smashed his hand on a cactus instead of the alarm clock. "You and Katie just killed me, man," she told him, remembering that first impression, framing it less as a job interview and more as fandom. She wanted in on whatever this show was doing. What followed was 11 seasons and 259 episodes, one of the longest theatrical runs of any live-action sitcom in American television. Christina went from 15 to 26 on that soundstage. The years, by any measure, in which a person's sense of self is still being built, when identity, boundaries, and a sense of who you are in a room are still forming. And by her own account, Ed O'Neill was a fixture in that process in a way that went beyond 2 actors sharing scenes and trading lines for a syndication paycheck. The clearest, most direct statement Christina Applegate has ever made about Ed O'Neill's role in her life came in August 2024, on the podcast she co-hosts with actress Jamie Lynn Sigler, Messy with Christina Applegate and Jamie Lynn Sigler. The show is built around their shared experience living with multiple sclerosis, but on the August 27th episode, they welcomed O'Neill as a guest, and the conversation quickly became less about the disease and more about the show that first brought Christina and Ed together 37 years earlier. Introducing him to listeners, Applegate said she didn't quite know how to describe who he was to her. She told him, in essence, that he had raised her, that if there was anything people didn't like about who she'd become, it was his fault, and if there was anything they did like, that was his fault too. She followed it with something warmer. Years and years of her life had been spent with this man, and he was, in her words, an incredible actor and an incredible human being. She didn't leave it as a soundbite. Reflecting on their time on set, she told him plainly that he had gone through everything with her, including her mother's cancer. That's a detail worth sitting with, because it tells you the relationship wasn't confined to callbacks and blocking rehearsals. It extended into the parts of her life that had nothing to do with the show at all, the kind of thing you'd expect from a family member rather than a coworker on an 11-year contract. O'Neill, for his part, kept his answer characteristically understated. He remembered her as a professional from the start, someone who was simply good at the job, easy and fun to work with. It's a smaller statement than hers, but it lines up. The picture that emerges from both of them isn't of a dramatic, tearful bond forged in crisis. It's of two people who spent over a decade together, took the work seriously, and ended up genuinely liking each other. Elsewhere in the same conversation, Applegate credited him more specifically with shaping her comedic instincts. She's described him as someone who taught her how to find and land a joke, skill she says she carried into every role that came after, from film comedies to her Emmy-nominated work on Dead to Me. What's changed most, according to Applegate, isn't the affection, it's the shape of it. She's talked about loving what their relationship has become now that she's in her 50s. Being able to call him and talk for hours, laughing, catching up on everything, the way two peers do rather than the way a teenager checks in with an authority figure. The mentor and teenager dynamic of 1987 gave way, over decades, to something closer to two old friends who happen to have a very unusual shared history. One that started with a script about a dysfunctional Chicago shoe salesman and somehow turned into one of the more durable relationships either of them has in the entertainment industry. There's also a broader thread worth naming here. Entertainment writers have pointed out that O'Neill's arc as a performer, from the misanthropic but ultimately sympathetic Al Bundy to his award-winning turn as the gruff, evolving patriarch Jay Pritchett on Modern Family, reflects a consistent skill, playing difficult men who reveal real depth underneath the bluster. Applegate's description of him off-camera tracks with that same through line, a person whose gruffness was never the whole picture. The show itself nearly didn't survive its early years. In 1989, a Michigan homemaker named Terry Ricalta watched an episode and was outraged enough to launch a public campaign against it, writing letters to advertisers and appearing on national television to argue that the show was indecent and unfit for a family time slot. Several major sponsors, including some big national brands, pulled their ads in response. For a moment, Fox executives were genuinely weighing whether the controversy had become too costly to justify keeping the show on the air. It didn't work out that way. The controversy generated enormous free publicity, curiosity climbed as people who had never watched the show tuned in to see what the fuss was about, and ratings went up rather than down, one of the more famous backfired boycott stories in American television history. The show didn't just survive, it became more central to Fox's early identity than before, a case study still referenced today in discussions of the Streisand effect decades before that term existed. Whatever conversations happened privately among the cast during that period haven't been laid out publicly in granular detail by Applegate or O'Neill, so this account won't invent them or assign them dialogue they never gave. What's documented is the outcome. The show kept going, and the ensemble that had been targeted came out the other side still together, for another 8 seasons and hundreds more episodes. Married, with Children ended its run in June 1997 without the kind of send-off finale that later became standard for long-running sitcoms. It simply stopped. For a cast that had spent 11 years on the same soundstage, that's a strange way for something to conclude. No ceremony, no clean ending, just the last day of filming and then everyone dispersing into whatever came next. The show's finale aired as a regular episode, not a special event, and the cast has referenced that lack of closure in interviews over the years, sometimes with humor and sometimes with something closer to wistfulness. The absence of a proper goodbye has lingered in the background of cast conversations for years, showing up in interview after interview whenever reunion rumors circulate. It's part of why the eventual real reunions, first sporadic public appearances, then a serious attempt at an animated revival, then, in 2026, an actual live stage event, carry more weight than a typical nostalgia tour. There was unfinished business, in a small but real sense, and the cast has spent almost 3 decades occasionally circling back to it. That unfinished business took a concrete shape in 2022, when it was reported that Sony Pictures Television had spent more than a year quietly developing an animated revival of the series with the original cast, O'Neill, Segal, Applegate, and Faustino, all attached to voice their characters again. The pitch reportedly relocated the Bundy family to Florida after a string of financial misfortunes. Applegate confirmed in a 2023 interview that she and her castmates remained attached to the project and were simply waiting on a deal. A sample clip leaked online in 2024, but by July 2025 it was confirmed that the animated revival was no longer in active development. The door towards some kind of on-screen reunion had opened and closed once already before the live stage event finally came together. On August 10, 2021, Christina Applegate posted on social media that she had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. She later said the disease had been identified a few months earlier, while she was filming the final season of her Netflix series, Dead to Me. MS is a chronic condition affecting the central nervous system. It has no cure, and its effects, on mobility, balance, cognition, vary from person to person and can change over time. Applegate has been candid that the diagnosis came in the middle of production, meaning the final scenes of a show she'd spent years building were filmed while she was privately absorbing news that would reshape the rest of her life. Applegate has not tried to sand down how hard the adjustment has been. She's spoken about anger rather than acceptance, telling an interviewer flatly, around the time of her diagnosis, that she wasn't going to accept it, that she was angry about it. She's described gaining weight from reduced activity and medication side effects, and struggling to recognize herself. In a 2023 conversation, she said she genuinely couldn't picture herself working the long, physical hours a film or TV set demands anymore, and she talked about the possibility that her scene acting career might already be over, with voice work and producing as more realistic paths forward. She's also described the practical, unglamorous side of the disease, the unpredictability of symptoms, the way plans have to bend around how her body feels on a given day, a level of physical uncertainty that stands in stark contrast to the discipline required by a decade-plus career as a working actress who showed up on set, on schedule, day after day. On her podcast in 2024, she was even more direct about the emotional toll, describing periods of real darkness, a weight she hadn't felt in decades, as she processed what her life had become. Sigler, sitting across from her, has responded in those moments not by minimizing it but by staying present with her, reminding her that she's still loved and still makes people laugh, even now. That podcast itself, built specifically around two actresses navigating the same diagnosis, has become one of the more visible platforms for public conversation about what MS actually looks like day to day, beyond the disease's more clinical description. This is where Ed O'Neill's presence in her life becomes more than a pleasant footnote from an old sitcom. It's one thing to have a good working relationship with a former co-star. It's another for that person to still be someone you're calling weekly, decades later, while you're renegotiating your entire sense of your own body and your own future. Applegate has said that she and O'Neill talk on the phone for hours, not occasionally, but as a standing, ongoing thing, and that the wider married, with children, cast keeps a group chat going, checking in on each other regularly. She's described the cast, more than once, as her real family, distinguishing them from the work friends she's made on other projects. It's a distinction that carries more weight coming from someone who has worked with a great many people across a 4-decade career. Singling out this particular group, from this particular show, as the one that counts as family says something about what actually happened on that set between 1987 and 1997. In November 2022, Applegate received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, her first major public appearance since going public with her diagnosis. Katie Sagal, David Faustino, and Amanda Burse were there to support her. Ed O'Neill was not present that day. His absence has been noted by fans and entertainment writers, though there's no public confirmation of a specific reason beyond logistics, and nothing in the record suggests any rift between them, if anything, the opposite, given what both have said about each other since. A little over a year later, at the delayed 75th Primetime Emmy Awards, pushed from its usual September slot into January 2024 because of the industry strikes, Applegate walked onto the Peacock Theater stage using a cane, escorted by host Anthony Anderson, to present an award. The Married, with Children theme played as she entered. The audience stood. It kept standing. Visibly emotional, she thanked the crowd and, in her own style, diffused the moment with a joke about being shamed by a standing ovation for having a disability. The bit landed, the room laughed, and she moved into her presenter duties, including a callback to her literal first screen credit, an uncredited baby role from 1972. It wasn't stage-managed sentimentality. It was, by most accounts including her own later comments, one of the more unguarded moments of her public life since the diagnosis. Showing up, on a body that no longer does what it used to, in front of an industry that had watched her grow up on camera. Applegate's openness about her diagnosis hasn't been limited to podcast episodes and award show appearances. She announced a memoir, titled You with the Sad Eyes, expected to be published in the spring following her podcast's launch, giving her a longer format than a single interview or a single stage moment to lay out what the last several years have actually looked like from the inside. She's also written directly about her early years on Married, with Children, including a personal essay published under the title Kelly Bundy and Me, revisiting the role that first put her in front of a national audience at 15 and reflecting on what that character, and that decade of her life, actually meant to her looking back. None of this reframes Ed O'Neill as a secondary character in some larger drama. If anything, the more Applegate has written and spoken about this period of her life, the diagnosis, the grief, the physical changes, the fear about her career, the more consistently his name comes up as one of the fixed points she returns to. Not as a plot twist. As a through line. The same person who watched her grow from 15 to 26 on a soundstage in the late 80s and 90s is, by her own repeated description, still one of the people she calls when things are hard now that she's in her 50s. The January 2026 Wiltern event wasn't a secret spilling session or a tell-all. According to those who covered it, it was closer to a big, affectionate roast, the cast trading stories about how each of them built their characters, taking audience questions, and getting surprise walk-ons from two other actors from the original show, Dan Tullis Jr. and Harold Sylvester, both of whom had recurring roles on the series decades earlier and hadn't been publicly reunited with the core cast in years. Asked why they were doing this now, Katie Sagal answered with typical bluntness, because, as she put it, they were all going to die eventually, so why not? Christina raised her cane in agreement, and the room laughed with her, not at her. She used the moment to talk about her condition honestly rather than avoid it, describing living with MS in blunt, unsentimental terms, while also saying that being back in a room with that kind of energy gave her something like hope. She confirmed on stage what she'd already said on her podcast. She and Ed talk once a week, for hours. It wasn't a revelation. It was a continuation of something she's been saying consistently for years, that this cast, and this man in particular, never really left her life after the cameras stopped rolling in 1997. David Faustino, who played Kelly's brother Bud, was the one who actually produced the reunion, and in interviews around the event he described how it came together. He said that once he decided to do it, Ed O'Neill was the first person he called, and once O'Neill was on board, Faustino said, getting Sagal and Applegate to join was straightforward. Faustino has also reflected on what it was like growing up on that particular set as a teenager himself, noting the amount of adult content and language he was exposed to at a young age, which gives some texture to why the cast's protectiveness of each other, and of Christina in particular as the youngest series regular, mattered as much as it did. A second reunion followed in May 2026, at the Orpheum Theater as part of the Netflix Is a Joke Festival. Further evidence that whatever pull kept drawing this cast back together wasn't a one-time, emotionally charged exception. It's become something closer to a pattern, and one that stands in contrast to a 2016 comment from O'Neill, when he told an interviewer that plans for an earlier reunion attempt had fallen apart and that, as far as he was concerned then, the Bundys were done. A decade later, they weren't. There's no scandal buried in any of this. Ed O'Neill didn't have some hidden secret Christina Applegate finally exposed. What actually exists on the record, in her own words across multiple interviews and one very candid podcast episode, is simpler and arguably more moving. A 15-year-old was cast opposite a man 20-some years older than her. They spent 11 years building a hit show together through boycotts, controversy, and constant creative work. The show ended without ceremony. And instead of drifting apart the way most TV families do, they stayed close. Through her mother's illness. Through her own diagnosis. Through the version of her life that no longer looks like the one she expected to have. Applegate has said, more than once and in more than one context, that Ed O'Neill essentially raised her on that set, that whatever people think of who she became, credit or blame belongs partly to him. That's not a tabloid headline. It's a woman in her 50s, living with a chronic illness she didn't ask for, describing with real clarity who showed up for her and stayed. If there's a lesson in the reunion, in the podcast episode, in the standing ovation at the Emmys, it isn't a twist. It's the unglamorous, durable thing underneath all of it. Some working relationships, against the odds of an industry that isn't built for loyalty, turn into something that lasts 39 years and counting. That's the whole story. It didn't need to be exposed. She's been telling it herself